Hey, what's up? This is Twisted Mind, and you're watching the First Look series, an overview of the changes made to your class going into the Mists of Pandaria. The first thing you'll notice is Banes have been stripped from the game. The only debuffs you have to worry about on your target are your two curses that you have to pick from. Generally speaking, you want to always provide Curse of Elements. Curse of Enfeeblement is usually provided by the tanks, however there are some situational uses where you'll need the extended cast time in PvP. Your Dark Intent ability has been changed to a raid-wide 10% spell power boost, which means you no longer have to have people clamoring or fighting over which classes to put Dark Intent over. And the other raid-wide buff you can bring is if you get out your Imp, you still have the 10% health bonus. Note that going into this expansion, the intention behind the design of the new pets is that you aren't supposed to be locked into a particular pet per spec. It's more you pick the pet you want to have for its abilities, and they theoretically all do the same DPS. You'll also notice that your health stone now has 3 charges up from the 1 before. This is a huge boost to you and your raid because you can actually use 3 charges in combat, and they don't lock you out like potions do. Your soul stone also got a buff. It doesn't actually physically create a soul stone anymore, it just puts a buff on a target that you can use preemptively, or if the target's already dead, it'll just bring them back to life. It's also been tuned to match the other battle reses at 60%. Your demon soul is now called Dark Soul, and it doesn't have anything to do with your demons. Instead, it now depends on what spec you are. If you're Affliction, it gives haste. If you're Demonology, it gives mastery, and if you're Destruction, it gives crit. You have a new pseudo-tank cooldown called Unending Resolve. It does reduce your damage by 50% like the other tanks, however, in addition to this, it also prevents you from being interrupted or silenced for 12 seconds. To match the other tank cooldowns, it's on a 3-minute cooldown. This has no effect of burning your own health through effects like Life Tap, though. Your Shadow Ward is now called Twilight Ward, and it also absorbs holy damage for the first time ever in WoW history. A spell that can absorb holy damage. It's on a 30-second cooldown to match the Mage Wards. Also, if you had a macro before that used to trigger your pet's special ability, now you don't have to have a macro anymore. Blizzard made a button for you. Depending on which pet you have out, this new button will do the listed pet abilities, and you can see what those abilities do more in depth on your spell tab. You'll notice Life Tap now scales as a health percentage and has nothing to do with your mana in the world of fixed mana pools. The new Warlock class design is meant to scale with health and use a lot more health draining and health sacrificing abilities, so look to be working drain life more into your rotation. This design is only further supported by the passive Fel armor that you have, which has a 10% multiplier on both health and your drain life-like abilities. All Warlock specs at their core are a nuke, a dot, and a pet. I'm showing me specking Affliction here so you can see how my nukes or dots change, depending on the spec. Note the new Affliction Mastery, which should always be prioritized after reaching your respective hit caps and soft haste cap plateaus. So let's look at what's really going on here in the Affliction spec. You keep Corruption from your base Warlock ability, it still does the same thing it always has, and in addition to that you get 2 more dots. You get your Unstable Affliction, which you should be familiar with from the last expansion, and you also get Agony. Now keep in mind, Banes don't exist in the game anymore, so Agony is a normal dot that can be placed on as many targets as you want, and it still does theoretically the same thing it's always done, as a dot that increases and gains power over time, but more on that in a bit. Your Shadow Bolt turns into this new spell. Malefic Rest is a channeled ability that you'd be familiar with if you played a Shadow Priest, as it's akin to Mind Flay. However, it does do a base amount of damage, but what really gains power with this spell is that for your dots on your target, this spell, every time it ticks, will instantly rupture all of the dots and cause half the damage that they normally do on a given tick. So your new skill cap will be weaving in your refreshes and your globals in between the channel time. Also check out the overhaul to the resource system. Soul Shards are kind of like they were in the last expansion, however notice that the Soul Burn has no cooldown. You can use it at any time and burn 3 times in a row should you choose. For the most part, the abilities do the same things when they're soul burned as they did in the last expansion, and the buff duration that you have to spend them is about the same. But here's where it gets interesting. Check out the change to Haunt. Haunt now costs 1 Soul Shard, and it does an instant super spike of damage, but then it puts a debuff on the target that increases all the damage that they take by 20%. This only lasts 8 seconds, and you can't theoretically gain enough shards to come back to have 100% uptime, so you need to be choosy into when to use Haunt, and you don't want to overlap a pre-existing Haunt. So you can already see how this new Soul Shard revamp is going to be used a lot more in our rotation than the oh crap button it was in the previous expansion. How do we get them back? Well, this is one of the methods. Nightfall is now not an instant Shadow Bolt proc. When it procs, it'll still have the same spell effect of the 2 shadow arcs, but it's not an instant shadow bolt. It instead instantly regains a soul shard, which does 2 things. 1, it makes this rotation highly subject to RNG. And 2, it means that you always want to have at least 1 soul shard spent so you don't overcap that Nightfall proc. The other method of getting your soul shards back is through Drain Soul. Now here's the catch with Drain Soul. It has to tick twice before it regenerates 1 soul shard, and they've been really picky about changing up the rotation so it's not a filler spell instead of Malefic Grasp. Malefic Grasp is still the intended filler spell and will still yield a higher DPS value than your Drain Soul. So you don't want to have some sort of rotation where you're trying to keep a hunt 100% uptime. Though it has been stated that exceptional players are going to show a skill cap gain by trying to weave it into the rotation situationally, so don't totally rule it out as a filler spell. However, this changes below execute range. Below execute range, Drain Soul is your filler instead of Malefic Grasp, which means you're constantly getting back more of those shards. So depending on your haste levels, you can theoretically keep that hunt close to or maybe even at 100% uptime. Time will tell how this scales at level 90. The base default of your soul shards is 3, but to make this rotation a little bit more flexible and easier to not either cap or run out of soul shards, I highly recommend the mandatory almost glyph of making 4 soul shards as a base. Affliction AoE is also a little bit different from the previous expansion. Notice that your Seed of Corruption still does the same thing that it did in the previous expansion. Even Soulburned, it drops corruption on target. However, note that you can now place it on multiple targets. What this means is if you have 1 seed ticking on a target and you load up a bunch of seeds on a lot of different targets, the chain effect from 1 seed exploding from damage can daisy chain all of the other seeds from explosions. So theoretically, if you have the time to set these up, you can do a tremendous amount of burst AoE all at once by daisy chaining seeds together. Also note that if you run out of globals or targets to put seeds on, you can always rain of fire still. Also note that you can still glyph soul swap just like in the last expansion. However, some additional functionality has been added to it because you can now burn soul swap and instantly apply all of your dots. This means no ramp up time for getting full dots on a target. Demonology Warlocks will note that their core abilities for the most part don't change. The first thing you'll notice is that you have a new resource bar under your mana bar. It's called Demonic Fury. Now Demonic Fury can stack up to 1,000, and at base, when you're out of combat, it will always regen, or at least try to start you at 200 before you go into battle. Also, most of your spells now have this Demonic Fury attached to their tooltip. Note here that Corruption, which is the dot that you should keep a full uptime on and maintain, generates Fury. And if you want to extend your duration of your dot while moving, Fell Flame also generates Fury. Your primary nukes, for the most part, are just Shadow Bolt spam, which also generates 25 Demonic Fury. However, Molten Core still procs in the game, and when it does, you need to use your Soulfire, which is essentially fulfilling the same role that Incinerate had in the previous expansion's rotation. Also note that this proc now only goes 1 proc at a time, it doesn't stack up to 3. Although the in-game power auras will illustrate this with only 1 arc of fire at a time, should you proc more than 1. Also, Decimation is still in the game, so when you're in execute range, Soulfire becomes your filler instead of Shadow Bolt. The new Hand of Gul'dan is an instant cast nuke that's still close to the same cooldown as it always has had, but it's actually 2 charges now instead of just a 1 cooldown ability. Now you can eliminate these charges and put a slow on it that's even slower, and it would be a theoretical loss of DPS, however this would be more useful in a PvP setting. The slow is attached to a dot called Shadow Flame, which is baked into when the dot actually lands on someone. Now, since it's now a dot, it can follow the target around, so if you like that old targeting reticule of where you had to place it on a specific point in the ground, you can still glyph for that. Although I would advise just keeping it attached to the target, because if the target moves, the new Hand of Gul'dan goes with it. The 2 charge system now adds a skill cap to the game, where theoretically you want to maximize the number of Hand of Gul'dan uses. You can also choose better when to use it, because the Shadow Flame has a 50% uptime compared to the actual cooldown of the ability, so if you want 100% uptime of a Shadow Flame during like an improved DPS portion, like say your weapon enchant, you can now choose to delay your cooldown of using it a bit, and then double use it back to back. When you reach a high enough bar on your Demonic Fury, which you can activate at any time, the higher Demonic Fury you have, the longer you can be in Metamorphosis, so my advice is try to maximize and use it at 1,000 Demonic Fury. Your abilities change around a bit. You drain a certain number of demonic fury per second while in metamorphosis form, and all of your abilities cost certain numbers of demonic fury. The abilities change up your rotation a bit. For one, your Fell Flame isn't just for moving, it's also an effective AoE cleave. Your Shadow Bolt becomes an instant cast, and you now have your Corruption as a spell called Doom. Doom is kind of like Bane of Doom in the previous expansion, and it actually stacks on top of your existing Corruption. This gameplay is further supported because your Shadow Bolt, which is now Touch of Chaos. Also note that your Hand of Gul'dan turns into Chaos Wave, and Chaos Wave does all of its damage up front instead of lingering on a dot. Metamorphosis still takes a snapshot of your mastery and all in effects before going into form, so lining up with your new Dark Soul cooldown is highly encouraged. The new theoretical skill cap for this spec is knowing when to pop into demon form and when not to, and when to save your charges, basically. In order to keep a high uptime on both of your dots, you're going to need to pop out of form to refresh Corruption, because although your Touch of Chaos can extend the duration, it can't keep it up permanently, and your Doom is only refreshed when you're in demon form. However, the form lasts as long as you have demonic fury, so you need to find that balance of generating demonic fury versus spending it in metamorphosis. All of your spells cause AoE in Metamorphosis, but you'll also notice that outside of Metamorphosis, Hand of Gul'dan leaves that lingering dot which can be on all targets, and your Rain of Fire has been morphed into Hellfire. You should be familiar with Hellfire from the previous expansion. It can still be cast while moving. However, they baked it into Immolation Aura for Metamorphosis form. As you can see here, it's a Fire and Forget when you're in Demon form, so you're free to use your other AoE spells while the aura is ticking on you, and it doesn't cause any damage to yourself. If you've heard the rumors about Warlock tanking, it's through this glyph of Dark Apotheosis. Basically, you get a form that has to be used independently of demon form. As you'll see when I apply the glyph, I get two forms on my form bar, stance bar. Essentially what it does is it takes reduced damage, it turns your Shadow Bolt into a melee ability, and it increases your threat generation. It's been stated by the developers, though, that this isn't meant to make Warlocks tank. It's just another situational use ability that finds its way into the toolkit if you're Demonology. You still take much more damage than any normal tank because you have no avoidance. And note that this also cripples your DPS because it puts a limitation on your Shadow Bolts by charges. However, it has proven to be an effective leveling tool, and it's a little bit flavorful in terms of the graphics because it does give those pretty rings on your back. And it may find a situational use in any of the new upcoming encounters. The Glyph of Everlasting Affliction might find your way into its toolkit depending on variables, but essentially it will lose value if you're doing AoE, but it'll gain value if it's a movement fight. I won't comment too much on it because it's still being changed around quite a bit. You'll also notice that there's a demo-specific glyph called Glyph of Wild Imps. Essentially, once every 20 seconds, modified by your haste, you'll summon a shadow or a little wild imp with your basic nuke spells. You can glyph to have more control over them, to just dump all 5 at once on a fixed cooldown that's also modifiable by haste. The reason you would do this is if you need extra burst in demo form. Also, if you want to line it up before demo form, these little wild imps give you Demonic Fury. So if you need to quickly pull Demonic Fury, it's the option available to you to have more control over popping in and out of form. Note that the passive effect of spawning an imp every 20 seconds is disabled while this is on cooldown, so use it wisely. Both Affliction and Demonology both have to manage their mana through life tabs still. There's an interesting glyph in the game that changes your life tab from something that'll actively destroy your health to putting a debuff on yourself that'll absorb healing. This can be situational. Notice that you can't, as of right now in beta, click effects that will generate health like a health stone, but you can drain your life back with other life drains and other life drain passives. It's the beginning of an expansion, so healers are going to be taxed, so this is another use as directed glyph under the encounter discretion. Destruction sees some drastic changes to your core abilities. For one, when you learn the spec, Corruption becomes Immolate, and your Shadow Bolt becomes Incinerate. Destruction's mastery's changed up a little bit. Basically, it's going to improve the burst of your Ember's Dump, and it's going to increase the fire damage of your primary chained nukes. Your Incinerate is now the filler spell for Destruction. There is no other choice. And you still have Conflag. And note here that Conflag is changed up a bit too. It has 2 charges and it doesn't need Immolate to be able to be used on a target. The double charge works the same as Demonology, in fact, as a increase to the skill cap, because theoretically you want to maximize the number of conflags you can get in your rotation. However, you do have some choice into when to drop them into your rotation, but I'll get to that in a bit. Immolate's been changed a little bit. When it crits, it generates these embers. Now, embers is the thing that is new as a resource for destruction. Basically, your incinerate spells will always generate embers, and your immolate will, on critical strikes, generate embers. You dump these embers into your chaos bolt, which is been changed around to it always crits now, and it's the bulk of your damage as a destruction lock. So you want to maximize your embers game for the maximum amount of chaos bolts in a given rotation. When you're in execute range, chaos bolt instead turns to your old shadow burn button. The Ember system is a lot to juggle, and you think it would be nice because it would save you mana, but you don't have life tap in this spec anymore, and you've also been gifted this ability to pretty much have like endless mana unless you're spamming your AoEs. So your alternative method of dumping your Embers, if you don't want to do DPS, is you can dump them into a heal with this spell, Ember Tap. Situationally, it could be useful, but for the most part, in order to maximize your DPS, you always want to be dumping your Embers into one of your 2 DPS spells, but this could see a lot of use in PvP. You could also spend your Embers rezzing your pet, and also note that this has the shortest cooldown out of any of the instant res pet abilities depending on your specs, so your pets are the most disposable as a Destruction Warlock. Destruction AoE also got pretty cool. Rain of Fire now, it's an instant cast, so it's a fire and forget, and you can also have multiple rains of fires up on different locations. However, if you dump them out too fast, this will tank your mana. Also note that the more targets are in your Rain of Fire, the more Embers you're getting back, and AoE is also cool with Embers. You can dump them into this Fire and Brimstone. What it does essentially is it turns all of your primary nukes or curses into an AoE. You can get pretty tricky with the combos with this. For one, your Rain of Fire now stuns enemies when it gets off 2 ticks, so you can cluster everyone together and then drop a series of immolates on them. The more immolates you have on them, the more ticks of that burning embers will come back from the immolate crits, and the more of those embers you can generate, the faster you can drop out more of these fire and brimstones. You can drop the fire and brimstones then into incinerates or conflags, and conflag is situationally useful too because it'll put a slow on everybody. Your Bane of Havoc also got a change up. It now casts the next 3 nukes on a target, which is really good for dumping a Chaos Bolt in your rotation because note, Chaos Bolt always crits and it'll crit both targets. You can't shoot 2 bolts at the same target, but anytime that you can cleave damage, this is going to be the superior spec. Destruction now has this cool gameplay style where you're trying to maximize the number of embers you're getting, and it's not always going to be fluid because of it's generated from the crits from your immolate and incinerate. It also does some weird stuff with your secondary stats because technically now you have a complete fixed rotation should you actually attain the proper stats for it. Conflag is on a fixed cooldown, and it will always generate 3 charges of backdraft, which can be spent on your incinerates, or you can dump 3 charges on 1 Chaos Bolt. And your immolate is also on a fixed duration, which means theoretically there's a haste level that you can obtain to get your incinerates to cast in a perfect rotation with your immolates and a Chaos Bolt, where it'll generate enough of those Burning Embers charges to dump 1 Chaos Bolt per rotation. Although the skill in this spec now is for you can save up your charges and then dump 3 Chaos Bolts in a row, or 4 if you're glyph for the extra Burning Ember. And theoretically that also means there's a soft crit cap that is obtainable to match your haste level rotation. Another creativity of this spec is your Ember generation will always go up depending on how many targets are up, so anytime you can cleave or do multiple damage on more than 1 target, always look for a way to maximize your Ember generation with that. This is also now the primary control spec, so for PvP this is a huge boost because you now have multiple stuns you can slow, and you can have on-demand crits for burst. And note that spells like your Embers dumps are both shadow, so it's a little bit of an immunity technically to lockouts. One last glyph I want to include is the glyph of Dark Soul. This glyph will sort of technically spread out your damage in conjunction with this cooldown that you have. However, this will entirely depend on the encounter length and the spec that you're in. You're going to learn 2 spells on the road to 90. One, Demonic Gateway. It's going to be another charge-like ability that every 15 seconds it'll generate a charge. It's basically the same thing as your Demonic Teleport, only your group members can click on it now. Also, you're going to learn Pandemic. Pandemic has seen a couple changes in the beta, so I'm not going to comment on it in terms of when to use it in rotation, but essentially what they're trying to accomplish is less harshness for overlapping and clipping a dot too early when you're refreshing your dots. This is supposed to make it much more forgiving and flexible. If you like this vid or others on my site, you can help support me by liking, favoriting, subscribing, and even commenting. I'll try to respond best I can. And thanks for all the support, guys. I really do appreciate it.